Good afternoon. I'm Jason Rzucidlo, coming to you from the 2019 NAB Show in Las Vegas. Coming up next, we'll have a panel discussion featuring the White House correspondents from ABC, CBS, NBC, and PBS, telling us what it's like to cover the Trump presidency.
I do think one thing that has helped is that at least at NBC News, and I think with you guys' outlets too, just knowing from being with you in the briefing room, we're 2 years into this administration, people know what's in store, which is that it is going to be a 24/7 news cycle. You will be working Friday nights, Sunday nights, Saturday mornings, and everything in between. And I think that our organizations, I can speak for mine, have really staffed up in order to support that. Because in the beginning, after the transition, in the early days of 2017, boy, there were nights where I went home and just cried because you're like, I can't do it. It was constant, and you were sort of totally run down, working truly, 20 hours a day, 12 days in a row. It was constant, plus the travel, plus everything else. And I think that our bosses kind of realized, wow, we've got to put some more resources in place. This is the biggest story on the planet right now, and we need to make sure that our folks on the ground covering it are supported in that way.
You would finish your script, write your story for the next morning show, and then at times where the Post would inevitably break something at like 9 or 10, and you're like, oh my God, now we got to start from scratch all over again, and you're chasing and you're calling sources late at night, and you're writing these stories until midnight, and you're up again at 4:30 or 5, and then he tweets, and everything else is out the window. and there was this time for the first 6 months maybe where we were filing 2 to 3 stories per broadcast just from the White House alone. I mean, full capacity.
Twice a day, morning,
just treadmill nonstop running. That's slowed down a little bit. It's still, the pace is still insane, but it's slowed down a bit.
One thing I've noticed is this, I mean, like never before, Twitter seems to an outsider now to be driving the news cycle. Do you start your day, Yamiche, by checking your Twitter? What did you say at 2 in the morning? And does that set the tone for the day, the Twitter tone?
So the first thing I'll say is, before I started covering the White House, I didn't want to get an Apple Watch because I thought, why do I physically want something on my body? That's technology. Then I realized that President Trump was waking people up with his tweets, and that I needed to physically be buzzed awake at times to make sure that to understand that the news was happening. So I think that this has been an incredible time of upheaval. I think as much as we're all exhausted by covering it, I think there's also this sense of privilege, which is why we still do this, because I feel incredibly privileged that I can walk into the White House, that I can ask these questions to people that are in real positions of power. And I think that there is a sense that there is a hurricane. I used to cover, before at USA Today, I used to cover hurricanes and natural disasters. And I remember getting into politics thinking, oh, well, people have schedules and this is gonna be so much different and I'm gonna know what my hours are. And in reality, that's completely not true. But I think that at the core, there's still this idea that we are covering this historic president that is worth our time and worth our energy. But it is something that to really be constantly looking at Twitter, be constantly looking at the fact that the president is absolutely governing via Twitter, and this idea we're going to talk about, his communication staff. He himself, as much as he's president, he's also basically the White House press secretary. He's also the director of communications. He's wearing a bunch of different hats while also sitting in the Oval Office.
Does he need a press shop, or is he his own communications director?
I think that's a lesson that we've learned, as members of the press, we've learned it. I think every person that I talk to in the West Wing has learned that lesson again and again and again, which is you can have the title of communications director or press secretary or whatever. The de facto guy doing the job is sitting in the Oval Office. And there is an understanding and acceptance at this point in the administration. That's just how it's going to have to be. You had folks who I think came in early on in the administration, even we were joking backstage about the Scaramucci era, the 11-day era where Mooch was in as the director of comms, who thought he was going to make some changes. And to his credit, did what he wanted, did what he could do, but the president is the one who's going to drive what he wants to talk about. It is so different, and I didn't cover, this is my first White House that I've ever covered. I was on the campaign trail, as you said, and covered all the Republicans, all 17 of them, shades of 2020 Dems now, and entered the White House. But talking to my colleagues who covered, for example, former President Obama and Clinton and Bush, it is just such a different style. You used to have off-the-record discussions about policy that was going to drive the day. You'd come in the morning, and there would be an on-camera briefing to reiterate that message so that they could get on the evening newscasts with whatever, Iranian policy piece they were going to do. That just doesn't exist now, not because that policy is not happening, but because President Trump wants to talk about other things.
It so happened that President Wilson in the 1913 to 1914 era referred to some stories in the news as fake. The White House Correspondents Association was formed right around that time to sort of be a check on that, on the idea that the correspondents should band together and have their own self-governing rules about who could be a member, similar to the way it works on Capitol Hill, where the correspondents decide who gets a credential. It doesn't exactly work that way today with the White House. The White House decides who comes in and who can't. And most often people are allowed in. But it's just interesting how 100 years plus later, we're still talking about some of these issues about the interaction between the presidency and the press corps.
I think we had to learn as an institution how to cover Donald Trump. He came out of nowhere in terms of personality, and everything that he did was so different, and the tweets. And I think at the beginning, speaking broadly as a media, we jumped every time he tweeted. We jumped every time he did a phone interview during the campaign and early on in his presidency. Now I think there's a little bit more breathing room. There's some pause, there's some, what's the intention behind this tweet? Should we not cover immigration today and cover North Korea because he tweeted about it, or an insult at Stormy Daniels because he tweeted one? I think that we've learned that it's okay to pause a little bit more when it comes to some of these tweets.
We don't all feel the same way or think the same way or write the same way. Each one of us has a different style. The way Cecilia tells a story on World News or GMA is different from the way that Hallie tells it on Nightly News, and different from the PBS NewsHour, and different from the way that I tell a story on the radio. It's unique and individual, and we are not all the same. I think that's an important point that isn't often made.
I think it's also important that as we still wait to see what the Mueller report actually says, and past the principal conclusions, I think that there's this idea that the Washington Post and the New York Times winning a Pulitzer Prize for their work on Russia is something that is still, I think, to be celebrated. I think that there were so many times that we now read things a year or two later where we literally link back to a New York Times story from 2 years ago because a reporter had already figured out what the government is now just dribbling out for us to understand. So I think that as much as there's always going to be that need for self-reflection, I think there is also a need to not beat ourselves up and say, oh, we got this wrong because the president's not getting arrested. I think there are a lot of people who will say, unless the president got arrested and was carried out in handcuffs, the New York Times and the Washington Post, they just made all this up. No, I think that we still had a foreign government trying to really get at the Trump campaign and really trying to influence the elections. And I think that we should continue to report on that. And I think that that's something that's going to go into 2020 when we look at what foreign governments do and how they impact our elections going forward.
But I've heard it said that even though there's no daily briefing, that Donald Trump is the most accessible president. And is that true?
There is some data to back this up. Our friend Martha Kumar, who runs the White House Transition Project and is a regular presence in the briefing room, actually keeps these statistics. She has found that in the first 18 months, this is dated data, but in the first 18 months of his presidency, Donald Trump was more prominent presence in his interactions with the press than his last two predecessors. He beat Obama and Bush, 43. Not Clinton, though. Clinton had significantly more interactions with the press in his first 18 months than Trump has. But it goes to the question about the briefings and why there haven't been any. In the last 6 months, I think there have only been 4 briefings. And we've still had the opportunity to ask the president questions. I asked the president 2 questions on Friday. He answered them indirectly, but he gave me an answer. Look, the fact is, we have the opportunity to ask the president questions. What we don't have is the opportunity the regular opportunity in a controlled setting to interact with the press secretary in a way that helps the public understand what's happening. What we have now is this frenzied, freewheeling, seemingly chaotic exchange where we're the ones who are forced to shout over the roar of the helicopter on the South Lawn. And the president might take our question, or he might not, but it's not in a controlled atmosphere where the public hears the question and also the answer.
And I question how much substance you get out of that. I mean, it's one thing to say that he's more available than his predecessors, but these shouting matches are not often don't lead to the most substantive news exchanges. I will say people are often surprised when I say this. I covered the Clinton campaign, and then I came into the Trump White House and could compare the two directly. The Trump team behind the scenes is significantly more accessible than the Clinton team ever was.
And that leads me to ask you a clarifying question, and that is what you're touching on. While there isn't a daily briefing, is Sarah Sanders' role to help you on background? Is that the role that she plays? Is the administration helping you find out the facts?
Facts, I don't know. Certainly Sarah is available. Sarah is one of many people in the White House who is available and will make herself available by phone, by text, by email, whatever. It sort of goes back to what I was saying. Off the record, this White House is as leaky as a sieve. We all know that. I mean, there's no shortage of people who will pick up the phone and tell you myriad stories. I think the problem a lot of us have in our reporting is getting at the truth. You can talk to 10 different people on any given day at any moment in time, and there are 10 different versions of what happened in a meeting, and it can be a very tough nut to crack. But yeah, Sarah is available despite the fact that there aren't any briefings. Though that doesn't, I want to say adamantly on the record, we wish there were briefings. There should be daily briefings. The American public should see the journalists who cover their president being able to question them on a daily basis. That needs to come back.
There's this strange